Some people live their entire lives building a fortress of entitlement, brick by brick, without ever questioning if the foundation is cracked. Elanor Carrington was one of those people, a woman who moved through the world as though it were hers to own, judge, and control. But what happens when a fortress like hers collides with an unstoppable force of resilience, strength, and truth? Today, we're unraveling a story of two worlds colliding in the most unexpected way, a clash that would shake more than just the people involved. Welcome to an incredible and teachable story. Today's tale is packed with drama, redemption, and powerful lessons about change and unity. What happens when two lives collide in an unexpected clash? Stick around to find out. You won't want to miss a second. Show some love by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from, and you might get a shout out in our next video. Don't forget to share this story with your friends so they can join the conversation too. Let's dive in. Elanor Carrington was the kind of woman who believed in order, her order. At 47, she lived in an upscale neighborhood that she had carefully curated to exclude anything or anyone she deemed unfit for her surroundings. Her days began the same way. Coffee brewed precisely at 7 a.m., a quick perusal of her favorite newspaper's op-eds, and a morning stroll through her meticulously landscaped garden. To Elanor, every aspect of her life was a reflection of her good taste and hard work. Her friend group mirrored her outlook, women from similar backgrounds who spent their afternoons hosting charity luncheons more for the photo ops than for the cause. Beneath the polished veneer of her social life, Elanor carried deeply ingrained biases she had never questioned. She prided herself on her honesty and often spoke with a tone that dripped with condescension, disguising her prejudice as a matter of principle. Across town, Nyla Jackson was the polar opposite of Elanor. At 23, she was a whirlwind of energy and determination, juggling her studies in criminology with part-time work at a local cafe. Her love for martial arts had started as a way to build confidence during her teenage years and had grown into a passion she pursued with discipline. Nyla's world was grounded in her family, especially her younger brother, Caleb, who looked up to her as a role model. Despite the challenges of balancing her responsibilities, Nyla radiated optimism. She had an inner strength that came not just from her training, but from the values instilled in her by her parents: kindness, resilience, and standing up for what is right. It was a Saturday morning when the lives of these two women crossed in a crowded local market. Nyla had stopped by to pick up fresh produce, her mind on the errands she needed to finish before work. Meanwhile, Elanor was there for her usual shopping ritual, armed with a list and her ever-present air of superiority. As Elanor reached for a bag of organic tomatoes, Nyla unknowingly stepped into her path, accidentally brushing her shoulder. It was a minor mishap, one that most people would brush off with a quick apology. But not Elanor!
Which way are you going?
Elanor snapped, her voice sharp enough to make nearby shoppers pause. Nyla turned to face her, confused but calm. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bump into you," she said politely. But Elanor wasn't interested in apologies. To her, Nyla's presence was an offence in itself. Her voice grew louder, laced with venom. "People like you need to learn some manners, always thinking you can just do whatever you want." The insult hung in the air, drawing the attention of those around them. Nyla's expression shifted, not angry but firm. "Excuse me," she said, her tone measured. "I already apologised. There's no need for that kind of talk." Eleanor's face twisted with indignation. She stepped closer, her finger pointing accusingly. "Don't you dare talk back to me. You're lucky I don't teach you some respect right here." And with that, she raised her hand and slapped Nyla across the face. The market fell silent. For a moment, Nyla did nothing. Her jaw tightened and her hand moved instinctively to her cheek, but she stood her ground, staring Elanor directly in the eye. "Ma'am," Nyla said, her voice steady but commanding, "I'm going to say this once. Back off." Elanor, emboldened by her own audacity, scoffed and raised her hand again. But this time Nyla was ready. With a precision born of years of training, she caught Eleanor's wrist mid-swing and stepped to the side, twisting Eleanor's arm just enough to make her yelp in surprise. In a single fluid motion, Nyla released her grip and stepped back, putting a safe distance between them. "You're not going to hit me again," she said, her voice calm but firm. Elanor stumbled, clutching her wrist and glaring at Nyla. "How dare you!" she shrieked, but the shock in her voice betrayed her fear. By now a small crowd had gathered. Some whispered in disbelief while others recorded the confrontation on their phones. Eleanor's face turned red, not from the physical altercation, but from the humiliation of being challenged in public. One onlooker, an older woman, stepped forward. "Maybe you should leave before you embarrass yourself any further," she said to Elanor, her tones scathing. But Elanor wasn't done. She pointed a shaking finger at Nyla. "This isn't over," she spat before storming away, leaving the market abuzz with speculation about what had just happened. Nyla took a deep breath, gathering herself. She turned to the crowd and said, "I didn't want this, but I'm not going to let anyone treat me like that." Then she walked away, her head held high, unaware that this moment would change her life forever. The confrontation at the market was meant to be a fleeting moment, a clash of egos and principles that would fade into the noise of daily life. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. A bystander, a young man with quick reflexes and an even quicker phone camera, had captured the entire exchange from start to finish. By the time Nyla had walked away and Elanor had stormed off, the video was already making its way through group chats and social media feeds. It began innocuously enough, a small thread on a local forum titled "Entitled Karen Gets What She Deserves at Farmer's Market." But within hours, the video had spread like wildfire. Comments poured in, most of them applauding Nyla's composure and skill. She handled that with class. Finally, someone stood up to people like her. This is what happens when you pick on the wrong person. But as the video gained traction, not everyone was on Nyla's side. Some viewers claimed she had overreacted, while others tried to paint her as aggressive. Elanor, seen in the video as a woman in clear distress, managed to evoke sympathy from those who didn't bother to watch the entire clip or understand the context. The debate grew louder. News outlets picked up the story, running sensational headlines like "Market Mayhem," "Viral Video Sparks Heated Debate Over Respect and Retaliation." Morning shows hosted panels dissecting every second of the footage, and hashtags like "Market Confrontation" and "Stand with Nyla" began trending. Nyla, who had spent her life avoiding unnecessary attention, suddenly found herself at the centre of a national conversation. Elanor Carrington sat in her pristine dining room, gripping her phone with a trembling hand. She had seen the video, and the sheer humiliation of it burned in her chest. People, strangers from across the internet, were calling her names, mocking her behaviour, and turning her into a caricature of entitlement. But Elanor wasn't the kind of woman to admit fault. To her, the blame lay squarely on Nyla's shoulders. She seethed with anger, muttering under her breath, "They don't know the full story. They don't know me." She immediately began making phone calls. To her closest friends, she spun a tale of being attacked by a hostile stranger. Her version of events conveniently omitted her slap and amplified Nyla's martial arts moves into an unprovoked assault. "I was terrified," Elanor sobbed into the phone during one call. "She could have broken my wrist. I thought I was going to die." Her friends, loyal and just as out of touch as she was, rallied around her. They organised a meeting at Eleanor's house, where over tea and scones they devised a plan to restore her dignity. Eleanor's friend Beatrix suggested they reach out to a local journalist known for sympathetic puff pieces. "That girl," Beatrix said with a sneer, "needs to be put in her place. People like her think they can do whatever they want these days." The group nodded in agreement, emboldened by their shared outrage. Elanor leaned back in her chair, feeling a spark of hope for the first time since the incident. But Elanor underestimated the internet's ability to dig deep. Within days, her social media posts, peppered with thinly veiled prejudices, were unearthed and shared widely. Memes mocking her excuses flooded timelines, turning her attempts to control the narrative into a disaster. Meanwhile, Nyla sat on the couch in her small apartment, staring at her phone in disbelief. Messages from friends, strangers, and journalists flooded her inbox. Some were kind, praising her for standing up to Elanor, while others were vicious, accusing her of being a bully. She scrolled through the comments on the video, her stomach churning at the mix of support and vitriol. I didn't ask for any of this, she whispered, feeling the weight of a spotlight she had never sought. Her younger brother Caleb sat beside her, frowning. Don't let those trolls get to you, Nyla, he said firmly. You did the right thing. Nyla nodded but felt far from certain. She had spent years perfecting her martial arts, not to show off or fight back, but to protect herself and others. Now her training was being dissected and judged by people who didn't know her. One night, after hours of scrolling through news stories and comment sections, Nyla received a call from her former martial arts master, Daxton Harlow. His voice, calm and steady, brought her back to the days when she trained in his small dojo. I saw the video, Nyla, he said. You handled yourself well. Did I, though? She asked. I feel like I made everything worse. Sometimes standing your ground comes with consequences, Daxton replied, but don't lose sight of who you are. The world will always judge. It's up to you to stay true to yourself. The next morning, a local reporter contacted Nyla, requesting an interview. At first, she hesitated, but after some thought, she agreed. The interview was simple, focusing on her side of the story and her background. When asked how she had learned to defend herself so effectively, Nyla mentioned her years of training under Daxton Harlow. The name struck a chord with Elanor when she later watched the interview. Daxton Harlow, her childhood neighbour. Memories flooded back of a quiet boy with a passion for martial arts. She had dismissed him as odd back then, mocking his dedication with her friends. But now she realised with a jolt that Nyla had been trained by the same person she had once belittled. The irony wasn't lost on Elanor. The woman she had tried to belittle was shaped by a man she had once dismissed as insignificant. For Nyla, the revelation meant something entirely different. When Daxton heard about the connection, he told Nyla stories about Eleanor's childhood, stories of privilege, yes, but also of loneliness and insecurities buried beneath her haughty exterior. She wasn't always like this, Daxton said one evening, but life has a way of hardening people who refuse to face themselves. Nyla didn't know what to make of it yet, but one thing was clear. Her story with Elanor wasn't over. Some stories, like rivers, run deeper than they first appear. Eleanor's anger, her arrogance, her sharp edges, they weren't born in the moment at the market. They were shaped, moulded over years by forces she barely understood herself. Elanor Carrington hadn't always been the woman people saw today. Once she was a small, wide-eyed girl growing up in a grand but cold mansion on the outskirts of Savannah. Her father, Gerald Carrington, was a man of influence, wealthy, commanding, and deeply set in his ways. Gerald believed in order, and his idea of order was rigid and unyielding. To him, strength was in control, and control meant power. Elanor often found herself the target of his harsh lessons. If she spoke out of turn, she was met with cold reprimands. If she cried, he would sneer, "Weakness has no place in this family." Her mother, quiet and submissive, did little to shield Elanor. Instead, she retreated into her own world, leaving Elanor to navigate her father's expectations alone. There was one person who dared challenge Gerald's dominance, Eleanor's younger brother, Ignatius, a free spirit with a rebellious streak. While Elanor followed their father's rules to avoid his wrath, Ignatius defied him at every turn. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Ignatius packed a bag and left. He was only 17. Elanor watched him walk away, her heart torn between envy of his courage and fear of what her father's rage might bring in his absence. In the years that followed, Gerald's influence over Elanor grew. He drilled into her a belief in superiority and control, using the family's wealth and status as proof of their supposed worth. By the time Elanor reached adulthood, those lessons had hardened into biases, and her father's voice lived on in her mind, even after his death.
Back to the moment.
The market incident was a spark, but the fire had just begun. As more footage from the confrontation surfaced, Eleanor's lies began to unravel. Witnesses came forward describing the incident in detail, and their accounts aligned with Nyla's version of events. Eleanor's carefully constructed narrative, that she had been an innocent victim of an unprovoked attack, crumbled under the weight of evidence. The local news, initially drawn to the story for its drama, shifted its focus to Nyla. Reporters visited her workplace and martial arts dojo, interviewing people who knew her. "She's one of the most disciplined and respectful students I've ever trained," Daxton Harlow told a reporter. Nyla has always been about self-control and standing up for what's right. She doesn't start fights, she ends them. The more people learned about Nyla, the more her kindness and integrity shone through. A story emerged of a young woman juggling school, work and family responsibilities, always with a smile. In contrast, Elanor became a symbol of entitlement and prejudice. Her friends, once loyal defenders, began to distance themselves. Beatrix, the same woman who had suggested reaching out to a journalist, now avoided Eleanor's calls. Even her social circle had limits to their loyalty when public opinion turned so sharply against her. Eleanor's downward spiral seemed inevitable, but an unexpected voice entered the conversation. Ignatius Carrington. Ignatius had been living a quiet life far from the family's wealth and influence. He worked as a social worker in a neighbouring city, dedicating his life to helping those in need. When he saw the video of the market confrontation, he recognised Elanor immediately. For days, Ignatius debated whether to get involved. Their relationship had been non-existent for decades, and he wasn't sure he could change her mind about anything. But then he saw an interview with Nyla where she spoke not about revenge, but about justice and equality. "She could have destroyed me if she wanted to," Nyla had said in the interview, her voice calm but powerful. "But that's not what I stand for. I just want people to understand that everyone deserves respect." Something in Nyla's words moved Ignatius. He decided it was time to speak. In a public statement, Ignatius revealed the harsh upbringing he and Elanor had endured. He described their father's unrelenting need for control and how it had shaped Eleanor's worldview. But he also held her accountable. "My sister's actions were wrong, and she needs to take responsibility," Ignatius said. "But I also hope this serves as a wake-up call, not just for Elanor, but for all of us. Prejudice doesn't come from nowhere, it's taught, often in silence and shadows. We have to do better for ourselves and for the next generation." Ignatius's words resonated deeply with the public. For the first time, Eleanor's actions were seen not just as a personal failing, but as part of a larger story about privilege, prejudice, and the cycles of behaviour that perpetuate them. As Eleanor's world fell apart, Nyla faced a decision of her own. The public pressure to press charges against Elanor was immense, and many believed it was the only way to hold her accountable. But Nyla hesitated. It wasn't out of fear or doubt, it was a question of purpose. What did she want to achieve? One evening, as she sat in her living room, Caleb spoke up. "If you press charges, she'll face the consequences. But if you don't, what will you do instead?" Nyla thought about that question for a long time. Finally, she made her choice. In a televised statement, Nyla announced that she would not be pressing charges. "This isn't about one person," she said. "It's about all of us, about how we see each other, how we treat each other, and how we teach the next generation. I don't need to punish Elanor to make my point. I'd rather use this moment to talk about the bigger picture, about systemic prejudice, about respect, and about change." Her words struck a chord. Social media lit up with discussions about systemic inequality, martial arts as a form of empowerment, and the courage it takes to rise above hate. Elanor watched Nyla's statement from the solitude of her now empty dining room. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Shame, and beneath that, a flicker of something even more foreign, the possibility of change. Elanor Carrington's life had been built on a foundation she thought was unshakable: wealth, privilege, and status. But now, as her reputation crumbled, she began to realise that the ground beneath her was nothing but sand, slipping away with every passing day. The fallout from the market incident was relentless. Eleanor's job as a public relations consultant, a position she'd often boasted about, was the first casualty. The firm's management, citing the negative attention she had brought, politely but firmly let her go. Her social circle, once filled with ladies who lunched and whispered gossip over champagne, had grown eerily quiet. Invitations ceased. Texts went unanswered. Beatrix, her closest ally, was now spotted at charity events speaking passionately about the importance of accountability, a thinly veiled attempt to distance herself from Eleanor's scandal. Elanor sat alone in her opulent living room, staring at the walls lined with family portraits. For the first time, the faces in those frames felt like strangers. Her father's stern visage loomed largest, his eyes seemingly watching her even now, judging her from beyond the grave. Her solitude was broken one evening by an unexpected visitor, Helena Porter, an old acquaintance from her college days. Helena, once shy and soft-spoken, had blossomed into a confident activist known for her work with underprivileged communities. Elanor hadn't seen her in years. Helena wasted no time on pleasantries. "I'm here because I think it's time you face the truth, Elanor." "What truth?" Elanor snapped, her defensiveness kicking in. Helena sighed, her voice heavy with frustration and sadness. "Do you remember Charlotte, my sister?" Eleanor's brows furrowed. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. "She worked as your family's maid for years," Helena continued, "until your father accused her of theft. He fired her without a shred of proof, and your family blacklisted her from getting work anywhere in town. Do you have any idea what that did to us?" Eleanor's heart sank. She had been a teenager when it happened, more concerned with parties and friends than the lives of the staff in their household. She had barely noticed when Charlotte disappeared. Helena's voice broke. "She struggled for years, Elanor. We struggled, and your father's lies destroyed her reputation." Elanor felt a pang of guilt she hadn't expected. "I didn't know," she began weakly. "That's the problem," Helena said sharply. "You never bothered to know, but now you have a chance to be better. Don't waste it." Helena left as abruptly as she'd arrived, leaving Elanor with a swirl of emotions she didn't know how to process. For the first time, she began to question not just her recent actions, but the entire framework of her life. While Elanor wrestled with her past, Nyla was stepping into a brighter future. The viral video had brought challenges, but it had also opened doors. One day, she received an invitation from a local community centre to host a self-defence workshop. The centre's director, an older woman named Lavinia, had been inspired by Nyla's story and saw an opportunity to empower others. At first, Nyla was hesitant. She had never taught before, and the idea of standing in front of a group of strangers was daunting. But Lavinia's warmth and encouragement won her over. The workshop was a resounding success. Women of all ages attended, eager to learn how to protect themselves. Nyla's calm demeanour and expertise made her an instant favourite. She found joy in teaching, in seeing the confidence grow in her students with each lesson. One evening, after a class, an elderly man approached her. His name was Cyril, and he had been a historian in the town for decades. "I remember your family, child," Cyril said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've got the spirit of your grandfather, James. He was a fighter too, in his own way." Nyla smiled at the compliment, but was curious. "I've heard stories about him, but I don't know much. What was he like?" Cyril hesitated, then said, "Your grandfather stood up to a lot of powerful people in his time, including Gerald Carrington. There's a story there you might want to know." Cyril's words stayed with Nyla, and she decided to dig deeper. With Lavinia's help, she uncovered old records and newspaper clippings. The pieces began to form a troubling picture. Decades ago, Gerald Carrington had been involved in a scandal, one that had been buried by his wealth and influence. James, Nyla's grandfather, had been a whistleblower, exposing corruption in a local business deal that Gerald had orchestrated. The fallout had been severe, not for Gerald, but for James. Through intimidation and legal manoeuvring, Gerald had ruined James's reputation, driving him into financial ruin. The cover-up ensured that Gerald's legacy remained untarnished, while James and his family suffered for generations. When Nyla shared her findings with Daxton, he encouraged her to use the information wisely. "This isn't just about revenge," he said. "It's about justice and healing." Elanor, meanwhile, stumbled upon the same truth in a box of her father's old papers. The discovery shook her to her core. She had always idolized her father, believing his actions were noble and just. Now she saw him for what he was, a man who had built his empire on lies and exploitation. The stage was set for a confrontation neither woman had anticipated, but this time it wouldn't be about physical blows. It would be about truth, reconciliation, and the chance to rewrite their shared history. Please like this video and leave a comment if you haven't already. Let us know your thoughts on the matter at hand. Elanor Carrington had never stood in the middle of a storm before. She had always watched from the safety of her mansion, her wealth acting as an impenetrable shield. But now there was no hiding. The The storm was here, and she was at its centre. The town square was alive with energy, electric and chaotic. A large crowd had gathered, holding signs that ranged from hopeful messages of unity to searing criticisms of privilege and prejudice. Protesters chanted, reporters swarmed the perimeter, and camera flashes illuminated the dusk like lightning. At the heart of it all stood a makeshift stage. Nyla had been invited to speak, her voice now a beacon for change. She stood tall, radiating the quiet confidence she'd earned through years of discipline and resilience. Elanor, however, lingered at the edge of the crowd. She clutched a piece of paper, her apology written and rewritten so many times that the ink had smudged. Her hands trembled, not from fear of the crowd, but from the weight of what she was about to do. The murmurs began as people recognized her. A few jeers rose, quickly hushed by others. Elanor made her way to the stage, each step heavier than the last. Nyla saw her approach and paused. The crowd fell silent as Elanor climbed the steps. She turned to face them, her face pale but determined. I need to say something," Elanor began, her voice unsteady. The crowd murmured again, some shifting uncomfortably. Elanor took a deep breath. "I've spent my entire life thinking I was better than others because of where I came from, because of what my father taught me. And I was wrong, I see that now, but seeing it doesn't erase the harm I've caused." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "Nyla, I wronged you, not just with what I did that day in the market, but with the way I've lived my life. I can't undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I am truly sorry." The crowd was silent. Some faces were skeptical, others thoughtful. Elanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "My father taught me to see the world in black and white, us and them, winners and losers. But he was wrong. And if I've learned anything in these past weeks, it's that I don't want to be the person he raised me to be anymore." Elanor turned to Nyla, her expression earnest. "You had every right to press charges, to destroy me if you wanted to, but you didn't. Instead, you've shown me what strength really looks like." Nyla stepped forward, the weight of the moment heavy between them. She looked Elanor in the eye, her own gaze steady and unflinching. "I hear your apology," Nyla said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "And I believe it's sincere, but apologies are just the first step. True change comes from action." The crowd erupted in applause, but Nyla wasn't finished. She held up a hand, silencing them. "Forgiveness isn't easy," she continued. "It's not something you give lightly, especially when the wounds run deep. But I believe in accountability, and I believe in redemption, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary if we're ever going to move forward as a community." The tension in the air was palpable as Nyla took a deep breath. She looked out at the crowd, then back at Elanor. "There's something you don't know," Nyla said, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "I knew about your father and my grandfather long before today. I knew about the lies, the cover-ups, and the harm it caused my family." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. "I could have used that knowledge to tear you down," Nyla continued. "I could have made this about revenge, but I didn't. Because this isn't just about us. It's about something much bigger, about breaking the cycle of hate and ignorance that's been passed down for generations." Nyla turned to the crowd, her voice rising with passion. "We have a choice to make, right here, right now. We can keep pointing fingers, keep tearing each other apart, or we can choose to build something better, together." The applause was deafening this time, a wave of sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Elanor stood frozen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Nyla's words. She felt something shift inside her, a small but powerful crack in the walls she had spent her entire life building. Nyla extended her hand, a gesture that spoke volumes. Elanor hesitated, then took it, her grip firm but trembling. The image of the two women, standing together on that stage, sent a powerful message, a moment of unity in a world often divided. In the days that followed, the story made headlines across the country. It wasn't just about a confrontation in a market anymore. It was about change, about the courage to face past, the strength to forgive, and the hope for a better future. Nyla continued her work at the community centre, her workshops growing in popularity. She also began speaking at events, using her platform to advocate for systemic change. Elanor, for her part, dedicated herself to unlearning the prejudices she had carried for so long. She volunteered at the community centre, working alongside Nyla to support underprivileged families. The road to redemption was long and uncertain, but for the first time, Elanor was willing to walk it. And as the town slowly began to heal, so did they, two women, once adversaries, now united by the shared belief that change, no matter how difficult, is always possible. Elanor Carrington had always imagined her life as a series of perfect snapshots, a flawless house, a prestigious career, and the admiration of her peers. But now, those snapshots felt like relics of another person, someone she no longer recognized. The journey to redemption was not smooth. Elanor stumbled often, tripping over the weight of her own pride and ignorance. But she was learning, step by painful step, that change required more than words, it required action. One evening, Elanor found herself standing outside the doors of the community centre. It was a modest building, bustling with energy and warmth. Inside, she saw families gathered for a workshop on cultural understanding. Posters lined the walls, each one bearing messages of unity and empowerment. Elanor hesitated, unsure if she belonged in a place like this. But the memory of Nyla's outstretched hand pushed her forward. She stepped inside, immediately feeling out of place amidst the vibrant, welcoming crowd. "Elanor!" a familiar voice called out. Lavinia, the centre's director, approached with a smile. "I didn't think I'd see you here." "I almost didn't come," Elanor admitted, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "Well, you're here now. That's what matters." Lavinia gestured to a group seated in a circle. "Come join us. Tonight, we're talking about unconscious bias. It's a tough topic, but an important one." Elanor nodded and took a seat, feeling the curious eyes of the group on her. The discussion was challenging, raw and uncomfortable at times. People shared their stories, their struggles, and their hopes. Elanor listened, her heart heavy with the realization of how much she had overlooked in her life. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated. "I'm not proud of the person I've been," she began, her voice shaking. "But I want to do better. I need to do better." The group's response was a mixture of encouragement and cautious optimism. For the first time, Elanor felt the weight of genuine accountability, and it was both terrifying and liberating. Meanwhile, Nyla's life was evolving in ways she had never imagined. The viral video had turned her into a local celebrity, but she remained grounded, focusing on what truly mattered: her family, her education, and her newfound role as an advocate. Her self-defense workshops had grown into a full-fledged program, attracting attention from neighboring towns. Schools and community groups began reaching out, asking her to speak about resilience and empowerment. But with the spotlight came challenges. Nyla faced criticism from those who accused her of seeking fame, as well as backlash from individuals resistant to change. It was exhausting, but she refused to let it deter her. One day, after a particularly draining event, Nyla sat with her brother Daxton on their porch. The evening air was cool and the stars twinkled above them. "You're doing great things, sis," Daxton said, his voice filled with pride. "Sometimes it doesn't feel like enough," Nyla admitted, leaning her head back against the chair. "It's more than enough. You're changing lives." He paused, then added with a grin, "Besides, you're making me look bad. Everyone keeps asking why I'm not out there saving the world like you." Nyla laughed, the sound light and genuine. "You've got your own path, Dax, just like I've got mine." Months later, the town held its annual Unity Festival, a celebration of diversity and community spirit. The event was larger than ever, thanks in part to Nyla's involvement in the planning. The park was filled with food stalls, live music, and laughter. Families mingled, children played, and a sense of hope hung in the air. Elanor arrived quietly, unsure if she would be welcome. She wandered through the crowd, stopping at a booth showcasing art from local students. One piece caught her eye, a painting of two hands clasped together, one dark and one light. The caption beneath it read, "Together we rise." "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said beside her. Elanor turned to see Nyla, her smile warm but guarded. "It is," Elanor agreed, her gaze lingering on the painting. She hesitated before adding, "Thank you for letting me be here." "You don't need my permission," Nyla replied, her tone kind but firm. "But I'm glad you came." The two women stood in silence for a moment, watching the festival unfold around them. "I'm trying," Elanor said softly. "I don't know if it'll ever be enough, but I'm trying." "That's all anyone can ask," Nyla said, meeting her eyes. "But remember, it's not about proving anything to me or anyone else. It's about being the person you want to be." Elanor nodded, her chest tightening with gratitude and a newfound determination. As the evening drew to a close, Nyla took the stage to deliver a speech. Her words were powerful, weaving together the themes of resilience, accountability, and unity. She ended with a call to action, urging everyone to look within themselves and be the change they wished to see. Elanor watched from the crowd, her heart swelling with admiration. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, something worth fighting for. And as Nyla's voice rang out over the crowd, Elanor found herself clapping, not out of obligation, but from a place of genuine respect and hope.
And so?
Elanor and Nyla's story reminds us that change begins within and grows when we choose empathy, accountability, and unity. If you've been inspired by their journey, let's keep the conversation going. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge, teach, and uplift. Together, we can be part of the change.